Okay, we're about to dive into a pretty heavy topic, the history of torture. Now, it's really easy to think of this as something from a dark, distant past, right? Something we've moved beyond. But the truth is, organized cruelty has been a surprisingly constant part of human society, and it often served very specific and very public purposes. Let's dig in and see how.
So, here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at punishment as a public show. Then we'll see how torture was bizarrely used as a tool to find the truth. After that, we'll explore the strange idea of self-torture as a form of religious devotion, and see what happens when cruelty just becomes entertainment. And finally, we'll face the really uncomfortable part, how all of this still echoes in our modern world.
All right, first up, let's explore a time when punishment wasn't hidden behind prison walls. Nope, it was basically state-sponsored theater, put on for the whole town to see. And it was all about keeping people in line.
So you have to ask, why do this out in the open? Well, it was a two-for-one deal. First, you humiliate the person being punished, and second, you scare the living daylights out of everyone watching so they don't step out of line. It was a brutal, but weirdly effective way of sending a message.
Think about something like the pillory. I mean, just being locked in place like that is bad enough, but the real danger? It was the crowd. They could throw anything at you. Rotten fruit, rocks, you name it. Your survival literally depended on the mood of the mob that day. It was a terrifying lottery.
And if you want to know just how lethal this could be, let's talk about a guy named Titus Oates. In 1685, he was sentenced to be put in the pillory and then flogged all across London. The judges knew exactly what they were doing. This was a death sentence. But amazingly, this guy was so tough, he actually survived the whole thing. But punishment wasn't just about sending a message. Now we're going to shift to how it was used as a tool, a really gruesome instrument that authorities used to pull out what they called the truth.
You know, in the Australian penal colonies back in the early 1800s, flogging wasn't just a punishment. Get this, it was considered an administrative procedure. It became a routine, everyday way to force prisoners to talk, a lot of times for really minor stuff.
And check out the wording on that sentence. It's not you get 25 lashes. It's you get 25 lashes every single morning until you talk. That's the terrifying part. It's endless pain, and the only way to make it stop is to give them a confession, whether it's true or not.
And Henry Bain's case wasn't a one-off. Look at this list. One guy was flogged daily over a pair of pants. Another for the names of his gambling buddies. This wasn't about justice. It was about using brute force to get information. And it turned torture into just another boring bureaucratic task.
The logic they used to find this truth could also be just completely twisted. During the witch trials, they had this thing called the cold water test. It was a classic lose-lose situation. They'd throw you in the water. If you sank, great, you were innocent. Except you also probably drowned. If you floated, that was proof you were a witch, so they'd haul you out and execute you. And in a really dark twist of fate, the most famous witch hunter in England, a guy named Matthew Hopkins, was eventually put through his own test. He floated and, well, you can guess what happened next.
Okay, let's switch gears to an idea that sounds completely backward. What if the torture isn't being done to you, but by you, willingly? We're now diving into the world of penance, where people actually embraced pain as a way to get closer to God.
The most famous example of this is self-flagellation, basically whipping yourself. And this wasn't some fringe cult thing. The Roman Church was totally on board with it. You had saints who were so into it that their friends literally had to take the whips away so they wouldn't accidentally kill themselves.
Sometimes this was even a group activity. Just try to picture this scene in a church in Rome. The sermon ends, the candles are put out one by one until it's pitch black, a bell rings, and then, for 15 minutes, hundreds of people start whipping themselves in the dark. It is just such a strange and intense image of shared suffering.
And don't for a second think this was just for the common folk. Oh no, the most powerful people in Europe were doing it too. We're talking about a king of England getting publicly flogged, a duke being dragged naked through Jerusalem while being whipped. This just shows you how deeply this idea was embedded in the culture, from the very top to the very bottom.
So we've seen cruelty for punishment, and we've seen it for penance. But what happens when cruelty is just for fun? Yeah, this is where we look at how causing pain to both people and animals became a popular form of entertainment.
Back in 16th and 17th century England, so-called sports like bull baiting and bear baiting were a huge deal, but it's even worse than it sounds.
To make the animals angrier for the fight, they would actually torture them beforehand. They might blind a bear or blow pepper up a bull's nose, all to make the show more exciting.
Of course, this wasn't just an English thing. Spanish bullfighting turned this kind of cruelty into a grand spectacle. And this quote, wow, it really captures the horror of it, describing horses literally ripped open but still on their feet. It's a perfect example of turning pure agony into a kind of public art.
All right, now we've reached the most challenging part of this whole story. It is so tempting to listen to all this and think, man, the past was a brutal place. But this last section forces us to face the fact that these dark impulses didn't just disappear. They carried right on into the modern age.
The event we're about to talk about didn't happen in the Middle Ages. It happened in Ocilla, Georgia, in the year 1930.
A black man named James Irwin, accused of murder, was subjected to a public ritual torture by a mob. They cut off his fingers and toes, one by one. They pulled out his teeth with pliers. Then, while he was still alive, they doused him in gasoline and set him on fire. Finally, the crowd shot his burning body hundreds of times. In this one absolutely horrific event, you can see every theme we've just discussed. The public spectacle, torture to get a confession, and cruelty is entertainment.
The author of our source material really wants us to understand this point. This isn't ancient history. This happened in a world that had cars and telephones, a world we like to call modern and civilized.
And this wasn't just about mob violence. Cruelty just found new homes inside our institutions. In France, you had tiny punishment cells where you couldn't even sit or lie down. In Britain and America, prison conditions got so inhumane, we're talking damp cells, awful food, and torturous practices, that they sparked massive riots. The methods might have changed, but the cruelty was definitely still there.
And all of this leads to a final, really unsettling question. The pillory is gone. We don't have witch trials anymore. But has our human capacity for cruelty actually gone away? Or have we just gotten better at hiding it, moving it from the public square into hidden rooms, bureaucratic systems, and psychological games? That's definitely something to think about.